this idea of faith. In many ways, medieval religion took over the interpretation of the Bible. And instead of reading the Bible organically, where words have many different meanings, of course, there's a core etymological meaning, but there's a range of meaning in different contexts. And when medieval theology comes along, they want to translate the words to be constant, have a constant meaning in a theological context. So faith meant faith in the providence of God. When you look in the Bible, faith means something more like one's own reliability. So in a way, belief in God means one pronouncing oneself to be, as was said, a reliable, steadfast partner in God's will. So as you know, because I barely believe in the providence of God as a Lurianic Kabbalist living in a world where a broken world, and our main mission here is not to trust that our goodness provides, ensures that our needs will be provided. The facts of our lives and our knowledge of history does not seem to show that. So what we have to do, in as it were, believing in the mission, the divine mission, encouraging us to bring healing to the world. So if I believe in the mission, I don't need to be rewarded because I believe in the mission. I simply have to be loyal to the mission, to bring goodness to the world. So I'm not looking for a reward. I'm looking for my orders. Like, what do I need to do now in order to be loyal to the mission? So when you think of faith, I encourage us to move away from this more medieval idea that faith is reliance on divine providence. I barely believe that, but rather faith is like being a faithful friend, someone who is worthy of someone having faith in us. And so if one has a sense of the divine, a sense of covenant, a sense of calling, to be a person of faith means I am worthy of having faith in me. And for me, that really changes entirely the what I'll call the phenomenological experience of faith. And I want to talk about this a bit. Maybe I'll get back to it tonight and tomorrow, because my mind is going toward Tish Bav, the 9th of Av, which is coming up on Monday night and Tuesday. And as I said in my Shabbat thought, when we study the 9th of Av, the rabbis of the Talmudic period had us look at two biblical narratives to help us understand what I'm going to call the deeper cosmic dimensions of the 9th of Av. Before I do that, I want to give you a little bit of an update of what's happening here. First of all, one of the most startling things that has happened this week is that Netanyahu, for the first time, I think, in his premiership, has gone past the main opposition leader, Benny Gantz, in the polls for prime minister. It's still a toss-up that if the elections were held, which the coalition, meaning the Netanyahu's party, the Likud, or the opposition, meaning Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid. And by the way, as I said, I think last time, they're both centrist. I think a lot of politics in Israel is based on real hatred of Netanyahu. And again, as an American, I don't quite understand it. And as I try to ask people what it's about, one just gets dogma, which is fine with me. I mean, I'm sure I'm dogmatic about things, but one bumps into dogma and not reasoning. But the anti-Netanyahu camp, I think, since he became prime minister, has been very strong and certainly permeates the media, all media, except one miserable little TV channel over on the kind of far right. And so what accounts for that? Well, what accounts for that in my mind is a very belligerent attitude that the Israeli government took toward Iran and Hezbollah, number one. And behind that, this giant that's standing right behind Netanyahu, the Israeli government, the Israeli military, and saying to the enemy, if you strike, we will support Israel. We will defend Israel. And all the bluster of Iran about annihilating Israel and striking back and inflicting a severe blow, all that bluster, I think on the other side, this is the sense here, it more or less brought out in Israelis something like the following. Uh, we're tired of being afraid. You're going to attack us, do it. Because we're not going to be a nation that just lives in constant fear. I've been through that. Maybe you've been through that, where you say to yourself, fear is worse than what you have in mind. And that's actually been the message from the Israeli government. Do not live in fear. That's a kind of psychological warfare. And as I mentioned last week, everywhere Mirav and I went, as we're trying to, go from one administrative office to the other, there's always a little bit of chit chat, and one is Tia Milchama, just going to be a war. And people reporting all their, mostly male and sometimes female relatives at the front. That gets out of the way. People know somebody who knows somebody who's been killed in the war, wounded or abducted. And it's like every conversation has to have something of this preface before you go on cordial greetings. It's just everywhere. The newspapers every day run columns on those whom we have lost. They run columns on the abducted. The side that's saying any deal at any cost has become a little more quiet, realizing it takes two sides to make a deal. And for the other side to never come to a deal, some people say, well, it's all Netanyahu's fault. It might be. I don't know. No one's privy to the discussions. But people are beginning to realize, what if it's Hamas? What if Hamas is making unreasonable demands, and it's just creating in Israelis a kind of a despair? Now, I'm not saying that there are not many people, especially the relatives of the abducted, who are feeling despair. But there seems to be a large number of Israelis in supporting the Netanyahu government are saying, actually, we're tired of despair. We're tired of fear. And if you claim you want to annihilate us, we're ready. We will strike back, and we might strike first. And it's not a strike that you're going to easily recover from. We promise you that. The United States comes in with aircraft carriers and backs that up. And it seems here in Israel, because we were really, really, everybody here was ready for an attack. And we stocked up on food and water and candles, and we powered up all of our solar lamps and everything. The whole country was ready. And then it didn't happen. So the sense here is this idea of the brinksmanship. And there's only brinksmanship when you're at the brink, when someone says, we're going to destroy your country. I used to look out our window every morning, look at the Tel Aviv sky, a skyscraper, I guess, with a building. I thought to myself, are they going to be standing tomorrow? I don't know what's going to get through. Everybody felt they were looking around saying, am I going to be here? Are you going to be here? Is this city going to be here? But nevertheless, you're not going to make us fear. You hit us, we'll hit back. We might hit you first. And that seems, the rhetoric of the Iranians hasn't gone down. They keep talking about annihilating, but they've been saying that ever since they came to power. And then, of course, Jordan goes to Iran apparently and says, not through our airspace. Saudi Arabia goes to Iran and says, not through our airspace. We think to ourselves, wow, what's happening here? That Jordan, Saudi Arabia, most of the Gulf states are saying, don't involve us. So it seems that Iran has been painted itself into a corner. Also, Hezbollah, people say, has 100,000 rockets. Well, you all know, you might have 100,000 rockets, but you might not have 100,000 rocket launchers. We don't know how many rocket launchers they have, but it's not 100,000 of them. And the minute the first salvo goes over the border, what the chief of staff of the army has said, if you attack our civilians, there will not be a cockroach alive in South Lebanon. So you better be ready. Or we're done with this. And so you see these kind of perfunctory barrages that land in unpopulated areas. There's barrages, and of course soldiers are hidden in unpopulated areas. So there's been a few people hurt. But ever since the strike on the Druze village, where it was such a pinpoint strike on a playground, that there's belief in the Druze community that in ways that just leave us speechless, Hezbollah attacked Druze on the Golan Heights. Nobody can grasp that. And Israel, to show its solidarity with the Druze community, said, okay, we're going to respond. We're not going to kill a bunch of Lebanese civilians, but we will get the guy who ordered it. So they're outraged that their head of the missile program in Hezbollah was killed. Well, he deserved to die because he directed an attack that has killed a lot of people, but 12 innocent children in a Druze village. So he's on the hit list. Hania, as you know, was very much involved in the October 7th, and there's video of his joyously celebrating as he watched the massacres, on a video stream coming out of Gaza. And the Iranians say, "Well, you violated our sovereign territory." Well, Hamas kind of violated Israel's sovereign territory with Iranian backing on October 7th, and the missile barrages on April 4th. So this idea of you violated our territory, how dare you, kill Khania? There's a sense here that says, are you actually saying that? Are you living in the same moral universe that we live in? The man who plans October 7th is somehow immune. Iran, your country is immune when you sent 300, however many rockets they sent over on April 4th. You're immune from us. So Israel more or less is saying, we're no longer going to try to appease. You want a war, we'll take the war. The US and the whole world are going to say, please don't strike first. But in a way, saying to the Iranians, you better not strike first because this one's not going to go your way. So that's the mood here. I think there's, although you won't see it in the media, but the polls speak that there is, I think, an Israeli approval of how this government is handling this crisis. Otherwise, the rise of Netanyahu and Likud in the polls would be not understandable. So everybody here is, despite Iran's rhetoric, believes that the imminent attack is down. And if there is going to be attack, it's not going to be a 1,000 missile barrage on Israeli civilian centers. That seems to not be the case, although we don't know. Everybody's still ready. We don't know what Hezbollah is going to do, but the Army Chief of Staff has said, if you strike us, you're going to suffer. That doesn't mean they won't. I mean, remember, they do praise martyrdom, but things seem to have settled down for a while. So that's my Israel report. At the end of tonight, if you have any questions, I'll be certainly willing to take them. So moving on to Tish B'Av, I want to remind everybody a core value that we have at Or HaTorah, and of course many other places, is the dominance of the calendar in guiding our inner spiritual psychological lives. So no matter what I'm going through, no matter what I'm feeling, and of course we all have our own life journeys internally with other people, and just the journey of our interpersonal lives, our inner lives, and also the journey through life. Another part of us simply defers to the calendar. I might not be going through the saddest point in my life, but our tradition tells us to study Tish B'Av, which is the saddest day in the Hebrew calendar. It commemorates the destruction of the first temple in 586 BCE, the second temple in 70 CE. The theological themes there are that our sins brought this on, that I reject that in its entirety. But what we can do from the theology that I reject is understand the spiritual psychological lessons, which is in what way do I bring unnecessary suffering into my life? So that's my theme for studying Tish B'Av. Not that what happens to me is because of my sins. I don't believe it. I'm not saying that we don't sin. I'm not saying we don't deserve punishment for our sins if they're that significant. I just don't think that it happens. As you know, the righteous suffer and the wicked prosper. So I reject the theology, but I want to take seriously the spiritual psychology. So what the rabbis of the Talmud did is they gave us an incredible richness in understanding the spiritual psychology of the days by really inventing a rabbinic theory of time that is quite unusual. So let me share with you very briefly their theory of time. They believe, again, and in their, not that they overtly said this in some kind of discursive way where they laid out their theology, we have to infer their theory of time by what they taught. It's what they taught. That the destruction of the temple is rooted in 586 and 70 CE. The destructions are rooted in two biblical events. So think of it this way, that with the the incident of the molten calf, the sin of the molten calf at Mount Sinai when the people rejected Moses and the Ten Commandments. It's as it were, it impregnated time with a catastrophe, with a disaster that only bore its fruit in 586 and 70. And the same with the sin of the spies. The sin of the spies, as it were, a seed was planted into time that sprouted in 586 and 70. Now, this is not theology, it's spiritual psychology. So if they're saying that there's something in the molten calf and there's something in the sin of the spies that produced the great suffering of the temple, I don't think this is theology. I think it's some really deep metaphor on the inner life. And then the rabbis told us, if you want to understand sin, study the sin of the molten calf, study the sin of the spies. Metaphorically, they brought the destruction of the temple. We can put that aside. The destruction of the temple refers to, I think, our devastation as human beings, or potential devastation. So that's the first thing I want to share with you tonight. Tish Bav is coming up Monday night and Tuesday. There's mention of the holiday in Israeli culture, but because Jerusalem is clearly rebuilt, it doesn't. I don't think it means less and less as we go along, unless one is a Haredi Jew. So I'm going to put aside the observance of Tish Bav and focus on the teaching. So what do we mean by devastation? Well, in my certainly life as a counselor, I've been witness to people doing things and saying things that have devastated their lives. The most prominent to me was when I worked at a drug and rehab center, how much substance abuse and even emotional addictions devastate people's lives. When people are drinking, taking drugs, engaging in emotional addictions, it feels as if you can do no other. It feels you've been taken over, that your choice as a human being has been taken away. That's how it feels when you're an addict. Whatever agency we have as a human being becomes so small that the addiction is the most important thing in your life. What does an addict think about? My next fix. What does an alcoholic think about? My next drink. What do emotional addicts think about? Well, they're pursuing a way to enact the addiction. And what happens when one decides to go sober? And again, the first thing is simply not engaging in the addictive behavior. The addiction doesn't go away, but the behavior goes away. And it's an interesting thing. Until you decide to stop, you don't recover your human agency. And when you recover your human agency and go sober, at least from a substance abuse dimension, that's the way you actually start the inner change. You don't do the inner change and then stop drinking. You stop drinking so you can do the inner change. And that moment when an addict says, I'm not drinking, I'm not taking drugs, I'm not engaging in it, I'm not engaging in the emotional addiction, what it is a reassertion of our free will. The will is not free when we're under the sway of addictions. That's a deeply, deeply mysterious moment when a person looks at him or herself and says, I'm stopping. I'm not sober, but I'm going to stop using. Something happens, as I spoke the last couple of weeks of, some divine conspiracy of spirit and will and soul. Something is driving a time, not chronological time, meaning zman, but the Hebrew word et, ayin taf, it seems to be the word. Some spiritual time has been reached as some mysterious agency within us energizes spirit, energizes soul, energizes the will, and you wake up one day and you say to yourself, no more, no more. And once one has that moment, then it's as it were, then you can, as it were, do the work of sobriety. Now, as I counsel many people, of course, this goes way, way beyond sobriety. Especially, as you know, from my experience, is emotional addictions, especially addictions of anger, resentment, fear, defensiveness, victim status, even addiction to confusion, because people don't want to be reality. As I look at what I call these ego states, many people develop addictive relationships, as it were, with ego states. They lose their freedom of will as a human being because the ego state is running their lives. Now, okay, I feel, as you know, like an emergency room doctor. I only see cases when someone says, again, I'm saying metaphorically, an addictive ego state has taken me over. I need an exorcism. And traditional therapy doesn't do it. You don't say, well, let's talk about your childhood, right? What I say is first start with not using. Okay. Now it's odd because people say to me, don't I need to have insight to stop drinking? Well, if you said that in a rehab center, they'd laugh you out of the room. They say, okay, go ahead and get insight and call us when you're ready to stop drinking. Well, I see our inner lives the same way. When a person says, I'm addicted to anger, resentment, fear, guilt, shame, envy, the first thing is stop acting out. You don't need insight to stop acting out, except for the insight is that the habit that the ego state is producing is destroying you. That's all the insight you need. We don't know why we get addicted. We don't know, the conspiracy between genes and early childhood and everything else in our life and all the things that happen to us. And people say, well, that's why I'm this. My response is, you don't know why anything until you stop using. Now, emotional addictions are much harder than, of course, substance abuse because you can see the substance. It's very hard to see um, the invisible tentacles of anger, resentment, fear, guilt, shame, and so forth, because they present themselves as being natural ways of thinking and feeling. People always say to me, isn't it natural to feel anger, to feel resentment, to feel fear? So people make a claim of it's natural, therefore it's good. Well, a lot of things in nature aren't good. Earthquakes aren't good for people if you're in an earthquake zone, right? Tsunamis are not good. Just because it's natural doesn't mean it's good. Same with us. There's many parts of human nature that will destroy us. Just as Mother Nature doesn't mother us all the time, our own nature is not good for us. So a person says, well, it's natural. I said, therefore what? So it's natural to feel anger, therefore it's good. It's also natural for a human being to want to live a flourishing life and therefore have less of these emotional addictions. So when I think of Tish Bav, I want us to think of moments where, first of all, we're encouraged to look at your life, where some way of thinking, feeling, processing the world has led you to a moment of devastation, a moment of a catastrophe, or nearly. And this is one of the things I think that separates, people is just luck that something in me was driving me, and not because of my goodness, but because of good fortune, it didn't destroy my life. It could have destroyed my life, but it didn't destroy my life. And then one has to look at oneself as, how much further do we want to live on the razor's edge of reasonably good fortune preventing us from these somewhat demonic ego states of pushing us into catastrophe. I think that's what I think about when I come upon Tish B'Av. Now, remember, that's not what I'm naturally feeling right now. My life is about many other things, but because Tish B'Av is Monday and Tuesday, I force myself to review my life, to review the way my inner life functions, and to review the parts of my life. And I have the good fortune of living long enough to work through a lot of things. So a lot of it is looking into my past where my, as it were, natural inclinations were not guiding me toward my maximum flourishing as a human being. Okay. And had I given different kinds of drives of thought, feeling, emotion, had I really let them be in control, I would have experienced a Tisha B'Av. I think many of you can feel that. Not that it happened, but it could have happened if one let a drive achieve its endpoint. Remember, drives want to be extinguished by fulfilling the drive. And part of what it means to be a person of moral and spiritual integrity is to stop it, not let the drive get all the way through. You can push it back and say, yeah, I see that. I'm not doing it. So part of Tisha B'Av is looking at the drives that can destroy the temple of human life. Looking at the drives, not what happened, because maybe you were strong enough to to conquer your fear, your anxiety, your guilt, your shame, your desires, uh, the corruption of our narratives. And that's good. But this is the time to review it and even strengthen that. Okay, so that's how I observe Tisha B'Av. I ask myself, what in me could have led to the destruction of, as it were, my temple? And every year that I've been studying Torah this way, since as I was in my 20s with my gifted teacher, Yonatan Omerman, who really brought me into the spiritual psychological dimensions of the calendar, this is the season in which we face these things. All right, and so the last little piece for tonight, which is in many ways an introduction for tomorrow, is the two narratives that the rabbis gave us. I want to only mention one tonight, the sin of the molten calf, very briefly, and I'll develop this more tomorrow. Now, we talk about this every time we have the Parshat Ki Tisa in the calendar, which usually falls in January, February, if I'm not mistaken. But in its own right, as part of the narrative, this is where the people are at Mount Sinai. Moses has already received Torah portion Mishpatim, Torah portion Truma. He now comes down the mountain and so forth. So we study it in the Torah narrative. At Tisha B'Av, in addition to studying a regular Torah portion, we lift out the stories of the molten calf and the spies, because the rabbis have told us that these two narratives led to the destruction of the temple, metaphorically. So we're bidden to study this as a way to understand Tisha B'Av. Okay, so what is my main extraction from the sin of the molten calf? And then I'll conclude for tonight. The main instruction there comes from, remember, Moshe going up the mountain to receive the teaching. The people are betachtit hahar, at the bottom of the mountain. And it seems at the very end of the 40-day period at the bottom of the mountain, they say, what happened to that guy Moses? Right? Which is a statement of alienation, meaning that their tie to Moses as the prophet of God has made more tenuous, and he's, as it were, something that happened to them. We don't know what happened to Moses, they're saying. They know exactly what happened to Moses. He went up on the mountain to receive the teaching from God. According to the Talmudic Midrash, he was late. He said, I'll be back in 40 days. Well, 40 days from when he left in the morning, or 40 days from when he got there in the evening. So in that few hour period, they said, well, we don't know what happened to him. We don't believe in him anymore. Let's make another God who will lead us. And of course, they went back to old time religion, which is the religion of the worshiping the young bull or the molten calf, meaning metal was poured into a mold, hence molten, and they propped that up and said, this is our God. Now, we look at spiritual psychologically. What's that about? So here's how I understand it, that there's a teaching available. And sometimes it's a very simple teaching. For example, as I try to repair families, it's a really simple teaching. Don't speak in anger. It's a really simple teaching. Thou shalt not. Don't criticize. Complain to people about themselves. Use harsh language, condemn people, and get out of escalating conflict. I can't make it more clear. People say, you're absolutely clear. And then they say to me, but I can't do it. Time after time after time, people say to me, I can't not speak in anger. The anger overcomes me. I can't stop criticizing people. I can't stop complaining to people about themselves and really hurting people or triggering people. I can't stop with my condemnatory language. I can't stop escalating conflict. 1, 2, 3 and out. I know it, but I can't do it. And of course, as someone who's been through the addictions of these things, I thought to myself, you think you can't. You think you can't, but you can. So the first part of this is maybe what drove the people to worship the molten calf is they're believing there's no way that we can live up to the teachings that are going to arrive in about 6 hours. There's no way we can live to it. So we might as well get out now. Let's build a molten calf because there's no way we can live up. We think we know what's coming. We want to get out now. And of course, they were drafted, not enlisted. There's no getting out. Same with us. There's no getting out from the rules of life. If you think it doesn't apply to you, that the teaching heading your way whatever your issue is, there's a teaching that says, stop it, change it. There is a teaching. Now you can avoid it, you can deny it, you can say, I can't, right? You can say every excuse in the world. It will catch up with you one way or another, or you will inflict unnecessary misery on another person, which is just immoral. When people say to me, I can't control my anger, so I say, so you are saying to yourself that you have a license to inflict misery on people whom you love because you can't control yourself. That's your excuse. That's your story. You're sticking to that story because of your weakness. You get to lash out at people around you. My response is, you actually don't have that license. You don't get an exemption. You're absolutely commanded to not cause misery to other people because that is the definition of morality, which is how we treat other people. And I say to them, I'm sorry to give you the bad news. You're not a moral person. Because if, for example, anger inflicts harm, then it's called inflicting harm upon the innocent. Other people with their defensiveness say, I can't stop being defensive. And I say, you are enabling an angry person by being defensive. So you're complicit. It's very hard for people to realize that there's a law coming down the mountain. It's going to look right at you. It's going to grasp us and look at you and say, you need to stop. There's a teaching you need to follow. And if you don't, it's going to bring catastrophe to you or to somebody else eventually. And it might be catastrophe of death by 1,000 cuts, but it's going to be bad. And many people, they live through this, and they say to themselves, it's time to transform. So what I extract from the teaching of the molten calf is there's a teaching trying to reach you. It's coming down the mountain. It's trying to find its way into your life. And sometimes when we're confronted with a teaching, something in the unconscious ego self, the Yetzer Hara, says, I don't want it. It doesn't apply to me. I can't do it. This is not reasonable. All kinds of avoidances and explanations and excuses to turn away. And so when we come to Tish Bav, we say, because the rabbis have said, study the story of the molten calf. We rehearse during this time ways not to turn away from the truth, not to turn away from the truth that's looking you as it were right in the eyes and saying to you, stop it. Stop with those behaviors. Stop with that way of thinking. Stop with those narratives that justify the world that you've built for yourself. Stop these things that do not bespeak the further reaches of your humanity as a human being. Just stop it. There's a teaching coming your way. Stop talking, stop thinking, stop listening, stop giving excuses. Look straight at the teaching and say, yes, I will be faithful to the teaching. So Tish B'Av for me, I move away from the historical, as I wrote in my Shabbat thought, and I move to what's called the mythical, meaning not what happened then, but rather what happens all the time. What happens all the time is we reject the teaching. And I don't specifically mean a teaching from the Bible, but the teaching that you know that you need. It's a time to not reject the teaching, but accept the teaching, and then accept upon ourselves our categorical duty as much as we can to live by the teaching, which is being offered to us, as our tradition says, as a true gift from God.